All right, let's do our review for Bloody April. That's way too high. Okay. Look, I'm a big fan of World War I dogfighting games. And this is not that. And in fact, what this isn't, what it was designed for to be, rather than, the things that I would desire in a game, is probably one of my biggest gripes across the board. I had certain expectations that maybe I could use it as some sort of scenario generator for dogfighting, that it would handle squadron management type issues, that sort of the core of the game would fit better into something that I could use. But that's besides the point. I'm also not a fan of the system that it comes from, which the only game I've played of it is by the same designer, Elusive Victory. But Downtown, and there's another one in it, which are these sort of operational single, so operational is a weird term to use it. I guess dogfights are the equivalent of skirmishes. These are kind of like battles or period slices of air battles in terms of like that whole situation. So all of the scenarios in this game are 1 day in length. The campaign scenarios are kind of a full day where you have a little bit of capability to allocate your resources between different periods of the day. And you may be able to recycle your planes depending on what options you play with and what. What it doesn't cover is that sort of, hey, I have a general set of resources over the course of Bloody April, and I'm able to allocate, to specific missions. Maybe I have required missions that I draw, whatever, but I also have capabilities of when to send out counter-air type missions, what to hold in reserve, what to send as escorts, all that kind of stuff. Which would be something more, I guess, along the lines of a Luftwaffe type game. In some ways. That would be at a very, very high level. This brings you almost to the dogfight level. And in fact, I would say in some ways it feels kind of at times like somebody looked at Richthofen's War and said, yeah, what Richthofen's War is trying to do, I think can be done better. Now, Richthofen's War is a single plane, each counter is a single plane, and it's really supposed to be a dogfighting game, but it incorporates missions in it. But the scale of the game kind of makes the missions a little too truncated to actually reflect the real missions. So this is actually trying to give you the capability to do real longer distance reconnaissance flights. And stuff of that nature, bombing runs, etc., without giving you that sort of squadron management and real resource management outside of this is what you've got for a day, and you're going to be able to, maybe have 3 time periods in that day that you could reasonably expect to send planes up, conduct a mission, and get back during. And you can kind of stagger things and everything along those lines. And because Richthofen's War kind of doesn't get it right, you can make an argument that this is trying to cover that. And in that sort of fashion, there's a tremendous amount of detail, more than Richthofen's War has, in terms of the maneuverability of the planes, dealing with different altitudes, the different capabilities of the planes. And they're operating in flights of, depending on the missions and what you have allocated. I had a flight as small as 2 planes. They can go up to 6. Uh, and in the particular scenario I played, and I could only stomach one, uh, we're looking at, 3 flights on one side and 2 flights on the other, and okay. The problem with all that is the level of detail gets it to, so when you're playing a turn of the game, you're basically just inching your counters a little bit. You're not getting that dogfighter type swirling that you get in a Richthofen's War, or Unrealistic, or whatever that it is, or that you get in other games that try to be better dogfighting games. What you're getting is this slow, mutually aware of each other pulsing of activity moving towards each other. And a lot of mechanical effort goes into maintaining all that detail. Way more than I wanted to face. In particular, take a look at the sequence of play here. You have a random events phase, fine. It usually isn't going to occur, and it's going to generate weird things that the rules themselves don't generate, but it's a very small set of weird things. But okay. But you have to establish what the weather is, and that changes every 10 turns in the game. You get another check for that. But then, whatever the wind is going to move all the planes on the board, but it does it in kind of weird way. In some cases, if the wind is strong enough, it'll just basically blow all the flying pieces a hex or 2 hexes away from where the wind's blowing from. But the scenario I was playing in, the wind was moving at half that speed, which meant these 0.5 counters went on the board. And they were kind of intriguing because you can utilize them if they add up during the wind phase. If you have a 0.5 one way or the other, and then you get another 0.5 in that same direction, they just push you that hex after 2 turns. Except if you're in a dogfight. Or there's a few cases that aren't affected by the 0.5s. But under normal flying conditions, if you get those 0.5s, you can kind of buff them into your movement. And they'll either increase or reduce your movement. And you can use them to get a little extra burst of speed or, unfortunately, to absorb some of your engine power, maybe, instead of moving forward. The net effect is about what it would be from the wind anyway, but there are maybe a few little tricky gamey type things. And I don't know how gamey they are. A few little tricky things you can use the wind for when it's at a 0.5 modifier. Detection is one of the heavier aspects of the game, where you're basically, at times, when you're within 5 hexes of each other, potentially rolling dice for every pairing of airplanes, of friendly to enemy airplanes. So if you have like one friendly airplane who's within range of like 4 enemy one friendly flight that's in range of 4 enemy flights, you have to roll 4 times against those enemy flights to see if how aware you are of them. And then you get a choice of one to pay attention to. I do like the pay attention to aspect. I feel like the amount of die rolling on many of the turns is very, very heavy. But also, there's multiple levels of detection that are available. It's not just, I know where he is, It runs from, I got no idea there's anything at all out there, although you can see the counters moving, so as a player you do, and you can react to them. But those can be dummies to a limited number. In my scenario, with 3 on 2 flights, each side had 1 dummy. So most of the counters that are out there, I'm going to know, actually exist. But if you get within a range, which depends on your altitude, etc., of the enemy lines, they can start detecting you within there. And that can, expose you a little bit more. You're detected then, which means you can actually be attacked, but the enemy doesn't know what kind of planes there are present. They know that there are actual planes in that location. And they can see all the informational counters on your planes. We'll get to the informational counters in a bit, but that includes the altitude that they're at. That includes effects of the wind, trying to think what else, what kind of maneuvering they're doing and stuff. And all of that you can say, yeah, you kind of would know all of that. So that it's not disturbing that you know all that information at that point. You know all that information on the question marks that could be dummies, could be real flights as well. Call that a nod to making the game a little simpler so that you're not hiding everything for the hidden flights, because it doesn't really matter too much. The movement itself, I compare to paint drying, because at least with the planes I was using, to a large extent, as long as you're trying to keep your endurance level, your fuel conserved and whatnot, you're moving, somewhere around a hex a turn. That gives you tons of capability for reactions. You don't have to plot movement or anything like that. You get to see the things approaching and threatening. And there are possibilities to put on bursts of speed, especially if you have the wind at your back, if you don't want to conserve your fuel that much, etc. So mechanically it feels like it works all right. From a gameplay point of view, it feels dreadfully boring. And it is tedious in terms of the mechanical application of it, at least for me. It gets smooth at certain points. As you get more used to it, you're not necessarily studying, pawing through all the little informational counters, trying to figure out their interaction with each other, looking at the plane card again and again, trying to calculate. You get used to the altitude that you've settled in to do most of your flying on eventually, but you have to get up there, and it's a high burden where you're doing a lot of these mental calculations, fiddling with the counters and looking at them, but eventually you can get to a point where everything's pretty much the same each turn, and then you're just moving that hex or hex and a half or half a hex or whatever a turn, and the turns start flowing a lot more quickly at that point. You will also probably have your detection status set at a certain level, essentially, if you're far away from the enemy. Although if you do get close, the detection starts getting hairy again. And then you do have to worry a lot more about all the different interactions, because you're not just worried about, how far you can travel with your plane and turn, and how much endurance it's going to eat up to do that, and whether climbing is a possibility or whatever, and how many times you have to climb and all that. But you also have to take into consideration the same things with the other players' aircraft. And there's this weird time to climb factor, which essentially airplanes are rated for how high they are as basically what works out to be a fraction of the distance between the top and the between the bottom and the top, whatever, of a given altitude layer. They've got general altitude layers. The air density is taken into account for that, and all kind of stuff like that. The amount of oxygen in the air. It's all factored into the cards. You don't have to do a lot of thought with that like you might have to in Knights of the Air. But once you do get to a certain altitude, you're making different calculations, so you might have to get used to that new altitude and realize what your plane just does up there again. The movement itself is handled with a chick pull, which seems to work pretty well with this kind of pulsing. The Germans have a strategic advantage that allows them to just um, decide who gets to pull a chit first, and that'll tell you how many planes you get to use. I didn't check to see if the larger scenarios have chits that have 0 on them. That's actually a big deal. Chits that have 0 mean that the person who was selected to draw at that point doesn't get to move a plane and cannot move, doesn't get to move a plane and is not forced to move a plane, both of which are things that you might, or flight, both of which are things that, the German might be counting on burning one of your flights and making you do something ahead of him, or being able to get the jump and move his plane ahead of you. In the smaller scenarios, those zeros, and there are definitely more of them in the smaller scenario because I checked. I checked that, but I didn't manage to see if there were any zeros in the large scenarios. If there are not, I think that may be somewhat problematic, and I don't see any, but I'm having trouble spreading the counters out. Now, your dummies can eat up zeros. If you don't want to move, I don't think there are any in the large counters. And I think that may be a little bit of a problem because it'll start giving the Germans a stronger advantage than they have with the lower number of flights. But again, with dummies in play, your opponent might be forced to move something that's a dummy, which doesn't really hurt them maybe. But what's really key is that if you've lined up a shot, an attack possibility, you will get that attack possibility if you choose to go first. Anyway. Fighting is handled, there's sort of the basic and advanced version of fighting. Fighting is handled by just engaging. You make a couple of rolls against each other based on qualities of the pilots, based on the situation that you're entering the fight in, and see how many shots you get, and then each of those shots you roll and resolve against the enemy flight, taking down perhaps some of their planes. But the advanced rule, not optional, advanced, and what the game is designed for, I think, is to have hexes that become dogfights, and basically 2 counters, possibly a third. The defender can get a bounce, supporter come in, are tied up in what feels like it probably is more like, what's a game like Blue Max or Wings is representing, or maybe Richthofen's War, but God, I feel like Richthofen's War has always gotten so much wrong that don't worry about that. And that's just handled in a very sort of abstract way, where you're rolling the quality of the 2 flights against each other again and again in the same way that you would in the initial combat thing. The one factor that's in there is you have some capability to try to break away. And then the dogfight itself can move in and of its own accord. First of all, it can be drifted by the wind under heavy wind conditions. Otherwise, it'll stay in the same hex. But it can lose altitude in the course of over time. It will lose altitude. I think it's every 3 turns of the dogfight or something like that. And once you break out of a dogfight, it feels to me like, if I understand the rules correctly, there's a good question about that because the rules are not very good for a number of reasons, and I'll go into that. When you break out of a dogfight, you kind of get randomized and flung into a different hex based on your choice of how you want to disengage. And if one person breaks out of the dogfight, the other person can try to chase them and all that. And it's just all kind of things there. And they all kind of work. They all do kind of work. The biggest gripe I have isn't much to do with, like, I'm not looking at it and saying, wow, this got this really historically wrong. The only thing that I really thought it kind of got historically wrong or was inaccurate was the idea that when you're doing an an air superiority type mission, see, if you're just trying to defend stuff, you're just trying to defend stuff. If you're just escorting stuff, you're just escorting stuff. But some missions are these patrol type missions, which is what the Brits were doing in the scenario I have, where they give points for flying over an area. They're not trying to recon, they're not trying to do anything else. They're trying to spook or cause the enemy to come up and engage them because they might be dangerous, right? They might be up to something that's no good. There's neither any capability to change this air superiority mission to some kind of attack, even just strafing or something. You obviously wouldn't be carrying bombs in that. And there's no mechanism framing these scenarios in a way that you would fly that, although maybe in the campaigns it would work better that way, that you would fly that kind of mission and it doesn't really matter that, you know, you're patrolling over a certain area for a while and just showing your planes. That's really not that big an issue. The issue there is that the enemy has to react because it might be something bad, and you're not gonna be able to get your planes scrambled in time in order, you know, because it takes so long to climb, in order to be able to contest the situation if there was a real mission there. If it wasn't just a bunch of scouts out there hunting for kills. So something about that feels a little off to me, but you know what? The points for making those missions is so low that I'm willing to kind of wave it aside and say fine. And it, you know, it works as an excuse for how that smaller mission that I was doing happened. I'm not so sure that the larger missions even have them. Let me take a look at the first campaign mission that I saw, or the first campaign scenario that I saw, and see what kind of missions we're doing. Yeah, we are still seeing offensive patrols and whatnot. And so I'm really iffy about those just because it feels like that should be part of your economy of force kind of decision. What resources you're putting where and why and when, and whether you're trying to spook the enemy into scrambling early and waste some of his resources and some of his flight time, essentially. And not just waste, but also engage in that air superiority mission. And after you fight in a combat, after you break off from a combat, this is a nice touch. You have to make a check to see, even if you're undamaged or whatever, if your squadron kind of, if the flight that you're in kind of chickens out and decides, you know what, that was too close, our nerves are shot, whatever, and turns around and goes back and has to try to abort their mission, whatever it is. I like that because it covers sort of the psychological aspect that's going on in a way that I don't know if I've seen in another air game. It probably exists in Elusive Victory. I just don't remember it. That's different because you're not dogfighting in the same way, for the most part. Most of it's missile-to-missile attacks and whatnot, and all very standoffish, and just a less interesting topic to me. But then you end up having to make these tracking rolls again to maintain your tally on the enemy plane that you're paying attention to. And this will probably be maintained, but again, it's another set of die rolls for, you know, each plane has at most one plane it's paying attention to, so at most one roll per plane. But again, it's another pile of this stuff added on to that. And then there's a bunch of admin stuff that really has to do with the scenario goals, like if you take photographs or whatever. Just a bunch of cleanup between things. And then you roll around to the next turn and you get to move another hex and maybe something happens. Most of the turns are really, really dull. You're just moving a hex, and you're doing a lot of mechanical stuff to get to that hex, to get to that 1 or 2 hexes of movement or whatever it is. For the way I play, that's very disturbing because I'm like so fatigued after the mechanical stuff that I did that I kept going downstairs, giving up. And it slowed what really should have been more. I compare it to the SFB, Starfleet Battles, impulse chart. It gives that same sort of feeling where everything moves a little bit, and then you go to the next thing, and everything moves a little bit, and you've got a lot of time to kind of work on what decisions and what you need to do and how you want to outmaneuver somebody, and you get all the information that the people actually in the position are getting to make your choices on. Unlike the plotted movement dogfighting type games where it's like, okay, look, an Immelman is sort of an all-at-once thing, and it can surprise someone. Just like the barrel roll or whatever. Anything you do like that can kind of be surprising. But which way they're turning and how tight they're able to turn and stuff like that. Look, as you start to see it, you see what they're doing, and unless their plane just outmaneuvers yours, you're able to react and do the same kind of tight turn. You might lose a little bit of ground, and this covers that very nicely with this pulsing. But the problem is, unlike SFB, where it's basically just running down an impulse chart, Car Wars does the same kind of thing, and you just tell everybody to move, whose turn it is to move, and they move their hex. In this, you're doing a lot of mechanical stuff in that decision-making thing. And some of that has to do with the 3D element, being able to climb or dive or whatever. All of those choices worked in, but you're also doing a lot of calculations based on the aircraft capabilities just to be able to fly your plane. And that reminds me a little of Knights of the Air there. Check how my battery is doing. It's probably, it's still alive. Okay. That's one part of the big mechanical cost of the game. But there's another much, I don't know. There's another aspect to it, which is the designer made the choice to allow pieces to not just face hex sides, as in a usual game, or hex corners, but to give you 12 different rotation positions that you can be facing. Now this all works absolutely perfectly, right? It's a fantastic idea, except that what you end up getting, because of the amount of informational counters that each plane is carrying, and you have to paw through these informational counters when you're doing your movement and stuff like that as well, to make your calculations. You have stacks of informational counters sitting on top of each plane. So each plane invariably has at least one counter on it, but it may have up to like 4 or 5 sitting on top of it. Okay, is that terrible? Yeah, I gotta paw through my counters. There's some room for screwing up, getting my facing turned a little bit the wrong way, flipping a counter because it uses these, I don't remember what they're called, but the altitude counters basically have small numbers on them, so they rotate from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 just by turning its facing. And then you flip it over and it has 4, 5, 6, 7 on the other side. So it's very easy to screw up something little like that. It's easier to screw up facing when you're looking at 12 different directions instead of 6. But the biggest problem of all this is that you've got big stacks of counters, or reasonably large stacks of counters, which can end up all in the same hex, facing different directions, and it's just kind of asking to be a mess and asking to be a problem. Add to that, if you're facing a hex side or you're facing a corner, well, what's your forward movement? On the hex side, it's easy. It's into the next hex. On the corner, it's onto the hex vertex, now side. It's onto the hex side. And these are normal size hexes and normal size counters, so a counter pretty much fills a hex. You could have two flights next to each other, or facing each other, or whatever. But then you also have to have room in here on the hex side. And if you look at my playthrough, you can see places where I've got like counters tipped over, spilling across, and whatnot. I view this solution as being physically impossible to play, or at the very least, so painful to deal with that there's no good solution to it. Now, how often is it in that situation? I had the tipped over counter on, with a stack here and a stack kind of leaning against it twice in my game. It was a very small game with only 5 flights in it. I had situations where counters were stacked facing different directions, and again, piles of counters stacked in different directions, maybe 4 or 5 times at most. That happens more often because if you spawn a dummy counter, it has all those informational counters too, or else it's obviously a dummy, right? You have to have all that information that you need for the flight. So that's a really big factor in terms of playability to it. Add to that all the mechanical complexity that's going on, that you're rolling a lot of dice for anything you do. And then there's these brief moments where there's something interesting happening, where planes are actually fighting. Now in my game, which went 25 turns or so before I quit because the scenario was essentially over. The Brits were breaking off. They had lost 6 planes and hadn't done any damage to the Germans because that scenario is so fucking imbalanced because it has Richthofen in it. I don't see how the Germans can lose. Well, I don't see how the British can reasonably protect themselves. Their best goal would be to throw their hands up and say, you know what? If I don't engage, I don't lose any planes, and fuck my mission, I don't need positive victory points, I can tie by doing nothing. That's the answer to the scenario 3 that I played. The Brits don't advance. They just call it and go home. Which feels wrong, right? To me, what it should be is that there's some kind of victory point penalty if you don't fly your mission. Like, you'd get some kind of bonus if you fly your mission and you're not engaged. And you'd get some kind of penalty if you don't bother flying your mission, so that the Germans win if nothing happens, just to flow it. But, I mean, who cares, right? You can make up your own victory conditions and tinker with them in that way. It's just the victory conditions are very disturbing to me under that. Where was I? Yeah, so you're combining this very slow, highly mechanical framing to get to the dogfights. The dogfights themselves require, you don't have any options in them for the most part. I mean, you can try to retreat from the dogfight at certain times. Basically, it's a shit ton of die rolling. You're not making any tactical decisions or anything clever like that, but that's okay. But again, they're mechanically complex. You're rolling, 5 or 6 pair of dice rolls, maybe more, to check each round of the dogfight and see what happens. And you just, once you've lined up your shot and set it up, it's really just like it comes down to, well, it was all luck, so why did I roll that many times? Well, details, It's nice to see the details of what's happening. So I can understand that I have a certain appeal to that kind of game. I did find some excitement when I got engaged in dogfights, to tell you the truth. Even though I'm not doing anything dogfighty in them, At least something was happening in the game. It wasn't just watching these planes slowly crawl towards each other. And it's not like, it's not like they're trying to make any strategic decisions because there's not a hell of a lot you could do that way. You could try to get an advantage on the enemy. It's mainly by gaining height. But your plane's capabilities more or less determine what you're going to get in terms of height. You can fuck it up and give the other guy an advantage he doesn't deserve. But basically, a lot of it just comes down to what are the plane's capabilities, where do they end up, and what do they end up, how do they end up resolving when you get into that dogfight situation. And there's just tons and tons of this extraneous information being generated by all this mechanical process, much of which I find not all that exciting. I do find it exciting when I'm shooting down planes or getting shot down. Let's talk about components. So the board is normal size hexes. It's a cardstock board, nothing wrong with that. It's relatively big, which takes away one of the options, which would be to blow up the board and make it much, much larger. So that there's room to have multiple planes in a hex and to have things on the hex sides as well as in the hex and stuff like that. So that you don't have those complex piles, which are problematic. And I actually thought it had bigger hexes, and I was really confused when I looked at Eagle of Lil, the expansion that I have for it, which I did not play, and will probably never get around to. I really doubt that I'm going to ever play this again. Of course, I don't sell my games, so that's not going to happen either. But one of the possible answers would be to blow the map up and make it much, much bigger. And I guess you could do that, as sort of a treat to yourself. If you really like the game but can't cope with the mechanical aspects of it, it would be huge. There's also, and much of the game is approaching each other from your aerodromes, which takes a long, long time, and trying to gain altitude and all that. So you're doing a lot of game where there's just not going to be anything. It is going to just be paint drying for a long time. For most of the game, I would guess. It would make more sense to go to a smaller map, like less hexes, with more room on the hexes, and to plot when things are entering into various areas, and then handle only once like detection is possible or something. So where else am I? Of course, that wouldn't allow the enemy to chase you back to your airdrome, if that's an issue. But that looks hard. You don't have a lot of endurance or fuel in the game. There are a fair number, okay, let's swap out, of player aids involved in the game. Now, by the way, I think playing this on Vassal would be a tremendous advantage. I was making... I don't like playing board games on a computer, and I would rather play a game designed for the computer, which could handle things in even more detail. But I think if you really like this and want this system, I think playing it on Vassal might be the best option. I just can't cope with that. The designer says that's how he plays it. I did post as kind of a troll in Facebook. Somebody was saying they were so happy that they finally scored a copy of it with Eagle of Lil, and I said, yeah, but make sure you play it on Vassal because it's just not worth it otherwise. And I had like 3 people come back and say they play it with the physical copy. I don't know how. I mean, like, I managed with my small scenario, but the amount of annoyances, and a lot of that mechanical annoyance, I'm sure, is going to go away when you play on Vassal. First of all, You can have your counters stacked however you like, and you're not going to bump them, and you're not going to cause issues with them, right? So the game, the rules of Vassal are going to keep things where they belong unless you do something to mechanically make that change within the game. But on top of that, lots of the die rolls, the search die rolls and stuff like that, those can all be automated, and you could just get a list of the things you find. All those counters get affected by their detection checks, and it would all be taken care of relatively quickly. Of course, you wouldn't be seeing a hell of a lot of what's happening. You'd get glimpses of, oh, you found all these, whatever. Choose one that you want to tally with this plane. Choose one that you want to tally with this plane. And I'm sure it could be done really, really nicely. So a lot of the mechanical aspects of the game could be just handled without having to individually go out and roll each set of dice. All depends on how the Vassal module is set up. I don't know much about those, but I'm assuming that they can handle, multiple things and then give you a menu of options of how you want to distribute losses or something like that based on it. That you don't have to say, oh, I need to roll 2 dice for this, I need to roll, that you don't have to do each thing individually the way you do inside the game, that it can hand you the results of steps more broadly. Certainly, you could make a pure computer game that did that, but it could do so much more. For example, simultaneous movement. Okay. So the most important of the player aids for me was the sequence of play here, which has random events on the back. This was really, really helpful. It's actually nicely annotated into the rules and isn't a problem at all. This is for the solitaire game. This is your planning map, which is one way that you could conceivably mark your missions down, but it's just too tiny. You would have to blow this up to a much larger size to be at all useful for anything. To me, it's kind of a waste of page that something else could have been done on. We have a detection table. This handles all of the detection. Now, this is one that's really, really weird. Among a number of these, there are rules that are not in the rules, they're only on the tables. So if you read the rules like I do, you just sit back and start reading rules, you walk away wondering, I kind of don't feel like I got the whole game out of that. No, I didn't. The only way that I could get all the rules was by actually focusing in on the chart and actually playing it out physically. This, to me, is a horrible choice, but it is a design choice. It's not one that I approve of at all. That's all. And you got the sun arc diagrams on the other side. This is important because it can impact your sighting and stuff like that, and also your advantage in battle. You have random weather chart and then a weather change chart. The weather chart is if you want to roll the weather up, if you need to roll the weather up for the scenario. My scenario started off foggy, turned to snow. That's nasty. But it didn't really impact much because the planes just flew up above the weather system. They were able to get that high. But it has different effects at different places. And, the game even handles night rules, even though the planes can't fly at night very well. And then here, you roll to see randomly what changes in the weather. That can change the wind, it can change the type of weather. That's what happened to me. The only thing that happened was twice. First the fog changed to snow, then the snow changed, got another change, turned to snow again in the same level. Things for some of the missions. A play aid for the dogfight, which gives the dogfight procedure, but this is not a whole sequence of play for it. You got to dig into the rules to find the dogfighting sequence of play. It's not really handled there anywhere. And then something useless, again, some historical interesting stuff. It's not totally useless. It's where the aerodromes are, and it can be hard to find them on the map. So okay, but this is taking up a lot of a decent, not a great stock, but normal stock for play aids. You got a playbook which is filled with tons and tons of scenarios, which are all basically a day within the engagement period. No campaign rules that fit everything together, nothing that allows you to run squadrons. You can figure out ways to do that. You can add to the game. Nobody pointed me to any resources of those already existing, like, you know, something to run the kind of thing that even Richthofen's War has, where you're kind of managing the squadron, you're choosing your missions among different options and stuff like that within the campaign. Nope. Nothing about pilot improvement or anything along those lines, which, again, straight up dogfighting games contain. The rulebook itself I found to be very, very painful. Not only is it missing some stuff, it had a tendency not to give, well, okay. I was going to say, one of the things that I first noticed was there are procedures in the game that it just kind of hints at and then it doesn't tell you. They're in the play aids. You have to, but in some cases, you have to try to deduce what they actually mean. Because the play aids don't have as much information as a rulebook can have. A fair amount of the rulebook is, you know, a fair number of pages is handling this time to climb situation. I'm trying to decide if these are necessary. They're definitely helpful at getting the idea of the time to climb across. They may be important to know the exact altitude for something in the game, but I can't think of what. Because for the most part, you can convert the time to climb values into fractions and just compare the fractions. And I found that to be easier than dealing with these charts. But it is what it is, you know. There's a pretty good index, although it tends to trigger every usage of the word. That's better than nothing. It has bolds for the key elements of that particular rule portion, and it's usually pretty good. Decent designer notes, I think. Let me look through this, see if there's anything that I terribly... There's no... oh no, here it is, the table of contents, yeah. Yeah. They've got campaign game as rule 20, as page 29. What's up with that? What do they say about that? Yeah, that's list. So it's listed here as campaign game, and I expected when I saw campaign games in it that it would give me something of that squadron management type thing. But no, the campaigns are a day of time blocks that allow you to do multiple missions together. Now what they say here is campaign days can be combined with other non-campaign day scenarios to form an even larger campaign if so desired. Most scenarios can be played as a campaign by flying through all blocks in sequence. They give you damage repair between time blocks. But for the most part, there's none of the framework, and there's nothing that's going to allow you in these roles alone to play what sounds so exciting, which is like, you know, the whole air war during the Battle of Arras or whatever. And likewise, here, Eagle of Lille handles an earlier period, which is giving you like the Fokker Scourge era, and gives you a ton of stuff. Now, I forgot to add. Oh yeah, airplane turnaround is in there. Crippled airplanes get reduced. Yeah, I forgot to add the rules that were supposed to be added for both of to the main initial game. It doesn't make much difference. You have this big fold out most of which is devoted to fighting stuff. Fighting doesn't happen a lot in the game, of various types. It includes Archie firing at you, but it also includes the dogfighting type stuff in it. But it gives you an idea of how detailed, like, detailed is the right word, but it's also how mechanically complex the game is, because it's not giving you many choices. Once you decide to get into a dogfight, there's not a lot you get to choose. Just, did I want to break off or not? Everything and after that is pretty much just randomized. You have this log sheet, and on the back side of the log sheet is logs. So this is logs for airplanes. This is logs for ACAC. I think maybe artillery too. I don't remember. I don't know. Stuff on the ground. I did not find these particularly sufficient. I found some of the parts didn't even make sense, like the endurance to use checkboxes. Don't really work terribly well. What I ended up doing, I look at it now after having played, and I can kind of see a way to use it. That you're marking off every 10, but anyway, what I found to be the most useful was that I put a set of chips under each plane, well, poker chips aside for each plane, and spent those for my endurance. That felt pretty good. The other information, look, there's not slots to write the stuff you want, like your mission and stuff like that, but there's slots you don't have to use, like the pilot and crew. You can track each pilot individually, but there's not much reason to do that. Like, it's not really part of the game. It's just sort of it's a hinted at option, I think. And then you've got these guys, which are really nice, thick cardboard. I really question these. They give the information on each plane. I would rather have had, instead of the log sheet and a bunch of informational counters on planes, I would have rather had a poker card type thing that I could track a bunch of information on. Doesn't have to be this high quality. Could be, doesn't have to be. And then have the information on these just on a single, on a sheet of paper, a chart, and maybe you keep this and write down, the values. You're writing many of the values down anyway. Because keeping track of your endurance, keeping track of your ammo, keeping track of all your altitude, all the choices, all the stuff that's stacked up on your plane, on the board, all of that could have been handled off board with a single reference counter for the plane itself. I don't know, because then there comes the question of, like, well, what can I paw through, what can't I? The stuff that's on the counters you can paw through in this game. So in an opposed game, it does make sense. But it really, to me, again, feels like this is a game that was never really designed to be played as a physical game. And again, I know people who have done it, who claim to have done it on Facebook. I've heard people claim other weird things on Facebook too, so who knows. But I find it, while not absolutely impossible, I did it. I had to figure out some workarounds to make it easier, but I could see how it could be done physically with the components that are there as well as I did it. Might end up bumping some counters when you got stuff tilted at edge, Big stack up against another big stack. Not next to each other, actually both in the same space, but not stacked either. Just leaning against. I think it is kind of possible to do it. But my overall assessment is, boy, this is really a niche taste. Not World War One air fighting, not even doing the bombing runs, but like wanting to play something that handles the approach to the dogfight in so much detail, but not the squadron management side of things at all, or to such a limited extent because you're doing it day by day. Yeah, a campaign is at most a day by the standard rules. You have to make stuff up if you want to go beyond that, and not the dogfighting elements. Those are all really, really heavily abstracted. Really, what you're doing, most of the focus of this game is the part that I call paint drying. It's watching the planes slowly approach each other and and a whole bunch of mechanical die rolling and stuff like that going on within it. So I would say if your idea of fun is watching paint dry, this game is for you. No, I mean, look, there are definitely people who enjoy it. I'm not going to deny that. It has its niche. It's a small one, and if what you think is, I would like to be playing something, and there's some room for bluffing what you're sending out at a given time. It's this really slow, mechanically complex approach that's happening. That's what most of your time in the game is going to be spent on. And then you get a little flair, and it's pretty exciting. You get to roll some dice, and something actually happens. And then you go back to trying to slowly maneuver around with a lot of mechanical action happening in between, inside of that. I throw my hands up in the air and say, I just can't see myself liking it. I find Board Game Blogger's review of it, I watched after I started coping with this, to be pretty much spot on, which is like, yeah, if this is your thing, if you love, watching planes slowly approach each other, and seeing what effects, the wind and the climb and all that has on that alone, boy, this is going to be great for you. If you want all that detail in a dogfight, there are games that do that. Wings and Knights of the Air do that. If you want something that gives you that squadron management, there are games that do that too. I'd say Richthofen's War does a better job of that overlying or overweening squadron management stuff going on than this, which is supposedly at a level. This feels like it's neither fish nor fowl. It's kind of like, I don't know, if I was playing a big East Front game, I might be interested in the grand strategic level. I might be interested in the operational level. This feels almost like, yeah, but what if you were, in charge of just shipping the goods, loading trains and shipping goods, and that's it. Everything else would kind of abstracted away or something along that lines. I mean, it's just sort of like, yeah, okay, I guess. And it does not appeal to me on that basis. However, there are things in it that make it interesting. Not as a game, but as a resource. In particular, the order of battle information collected for this is tremendous. And I kind of think it might be worth having just for that. If I wanted to, not have to do lots of research, but throw together my own thing to use in a dogfighting game with that squadron management type thing, the resources involved that went into putting this together would really, really help. I do compare it to Richtofen's War a fair amount, because it kind of feels like it feels like Richtofen's War is straddling between the two things that this isn't. It's standing with one foot in the campaign game, in the squadron management side of things, and one foot in the dogfighting, and the actual play feels kind of like what this is what this is doing, but Richtofen's War gets it all wrong by like mixing all these scales and just not, you're like, oh yeah, I'm doing a bombing run and, I'm running like 2 planes to do the bombing run and maybe a couple of patrols, but also, it doesn't have any aspect of simultaneous movement or anything like that. But this is focusing so much on the details of that approach to battle. And maybe that's where the decision making is. I mean, it doesn't feel like it, but maybe that's where the battle is decided, is how much could you climb and whatever, as opposed to when you get thrown into a dogfight scenario and you're like, well, what height did I start at? And you roll on that, on some kind of random thing. This allows you to control what you go into the dogfight with, which is very interesting. And again, I could see doing it to get me into as a scenario generator for the dogfights. But I would still want that element of role playing and everything. It's like not actually spelled out in this. It's just sort of like, yeah, you can do that, and it gives you spaces to keep track of it, but it doesn't give you enough spaces to keep track of the stuff that actually applies to the game. But yeah, that's just what it is. I don't know. I did hold off on buying it until at least the fall sale, and I may have gotten it on kind of double discount or something, like if it had ever been put on sale and was in the fall sale, because I knew that it was kind of an iffy choice. And if you want to see Great Misery, go ahead and watch me playthroughs. It is very painful, especially at the beginning, because the rule book did not, the rules were lacking stuff that wasn't in them, that's in the play aids or whatever, or that you have to actually deduce out while you're playing. You can't figure it out. Oh yeah, there's also the setup woes thing, which is that there's sort of, GMT likes to put these in, especially with complex games. Here's a big extended example of play. I tried setting that up. It was more about the storyline than it was about trying to tell you what you do to affect the actual actions. It's telling you what your die rolls are and whatnot, but what it's not doing is telling you, put this counter here, mark this here, all kind of stuff like that. And instead, we're actually worried about the sartorial choices that the pilot has, and decisions that it feels like the player maybe should be making. For example, what your mission is and what hexes you're going to go through. Well, it doesn't say that the player makes those choices. The player is just a pilot in one of the planes in a flight doing something. So it's not taking the view, this expanded example of play is not taking the view of, here's what 2 different players are doing and the choices they're making and the actions they're doing to make the game actually work. It says things like, Captain Ball, who apparently is your commander in the little story, decides to fly over these hexes and doesn't link it into the rules particularly, doesn't link it into where those choices come from or whatever, and it just felt like it was kind of silly. I couldn't make it past a page of it, and maybe it gets better later on. But I'll tell you one thing, what it didn't do was tell you how to set up a scenario, how to make your calculations for your plane, stuff like that. It didn't give you those examples that I saw. It just kind of told you the story, the narration of what was happening on the game board without bringing the game components into play. And I felt like the rules kind of did that too. They give you hints of what's going on without telling you what you do to effectuate that. Some of that gets made up by being in the play aids, where rules are essentially baked into the play aids instead of being put in the rule book. And there's not much else in the play aid, which is what makes like the dogfight sequence, which is not in the play aids, I think. Maybe I missed that. Maybe I'm, you know, really weird, because that like is only in the rules and is completely laid out there in a sensible way, and it's fine. But the rest of the game feels like they ported any rules they could onto the play aids, so that by reading the rules you could, you know, kind of grasp a unified picture. Anyway, I'm just wasting time there. I'm rating it pretty poorly because A, it's not what I like. B, it's way too much effort for what it is. And then C, I consider the physical game itself unplayable as it is, despite people saying that they are able to play it with the physical components. I have no idea how, you know, because stacks of counters leaning against each other is silly.